I hope everybody agrees this is a truly rare opportunity. And I think on behalf of everyone in the room, before we even start the discussion, I want to thank all of you for such stimulating and original presentations. I do want, thank you. So if there are other questions out here. And we'll have a microphone coming around too. Okay, we have one here.
There's one here too. Can I start here?
Back here? Okay. So one here and then one here.
So what would be you speakers' recommendations to Mr. Obama as what our mission should be and our actions?
I think using the troops to fight war in Afghanistan would be the worst case scenario. We started with very few soldiers in 2001. Much of the fighting was actually done by locals. Now they have been, of course, marginalized by labeling them as Northern Alliance and all that sort of stuff. Our best approach would have been to be able to help the local communities from bottom up, to help them create or reform or improve and institutionalize their own structures. In terms of police, not creating government militias, which we are engaged in doing, by the way. Once you create government militias, they are governments. They are not peoples. So community police would have been for community to identify their own members who would be serving as their police, and then the government could train them and government could pay them, but co-ownership is critical. The same thing, local defense units. They disarm the country. Most of the non-Pashtun regions of the country has been disarmed, while the Pashtun regions are being armed. And this is creating, again, another ethnic tension in the country in the long run, because 5 provinces in the West were, in fact, disarmed by Ismail Khan, one of the local leaders. That 5 provinces fell to the Taliban in one day. And I talked later with Ismail Khan about his decision, and he admitted that this was the worst mistake of his life, that communities have to be able to defend themselves, especially if the international troops withdraw. Much of the rest of Afghanistan will be prey to those who have guns. And so that local community-based self-defense units like our National Guard, again, if the community identified who they should be, would have been the way to go. It would have been sustainable, and it would have been community-based structures. And there are the other structures that the communities have, and we should have been helping them build those and secure their own communities by building trust. But when we go into war and bombard villages from thousands of feet high up, we kill innocent people, and people are really getting angrier by the day, particularly in areas where the war is going on. And I think more troops and more warfare would be really more targets for the local population to kill Americans and also upset the locals. So it's not the way to do it.
As you can tell by the way all of us answer these questions, the tendency is to say what we should have done, and it's an unavoidable tendency, I'm afraid, because we see so easily opportunities that slipped away, and how much more difficult it is to conceptualize this problem of Afghanistan now than it was in 2001. But I hesitate to say this because I'm doing the same thing, but I would preface what I'm about to say by saying that one of the mistakes that we have made is the way in which we distribute aid. Too much of the aid, a great deal of aid was promised to the Afghans, and the vast majority of it went through contracting agencies that siphoned off the majority of the funds, so that, for example, if there was a road project or an irrigation project, a American firm or a European firm was given the initial contract. They subcontracted out to maybe a Turkish firm that subcontracted to a Pakistani firm. So by the time the funds actually got to Afghanistan, a very small percentage of it was left. The profit really went to the agencies that were able to get into the pipeline at the earliest possible point. that was both disappointing, a defeat in terms of how it, the demoralization. That's a form of corruption too, and it's a form of siphoning away resources from the people who need it. And I think one of the things that has to be a focus is understanding security not simply as a military problem, but security as also a way in which people understand their livelihoods, their future prospects, their willingness to invest in their families, their futures, invest capital into businesses. The only way that's going to happen is if people have a sense that the government is going to be on its side, that that their profits are not going to be stolen by government officials or by bandits or by others. You have to provide the opportunities and the context within which people can feel sufficiently secure that they're willing to invest in the future. I mean, this is something that we all can understand now, probably a lot better now than we were able to 6 months ago, when we see what happens when your IRAs are suddenly, your 401ks are not quite as secure as you thought, and all of a sudden your whole approach to life changes because you're not the things that you had always assumed are not there. And I think even more so it's true in a place like Afghanistan, that you have to provide the opportunities and people, give them the framework for really believing that their futures are possible.
I should add just one thing, that AID, I mean, most of us Americans are not aware that any money that AID dispenses outside, there is a U.S. law that they must give the contract first to an American firm. Okay? And that's the beginning of the corruption, because they won't do the work, they'll pass it on subcontractors and so forth. And that law should be changed if the case. No, I'm done. I just wanted to clear up.
So to be really sincere, I'm not American, so who I am to give a recommendation to the president of this country. And secondly, I'm an anthropologist, and I'm deeply convinced that my knowledge doesn't interest anybody. So that's an easy escape, I would say. But I probably agree almost word by word with what Nazif Sharani and David Edwards just said. And that's true also. We don't have to complain about the lost opportunities. We still have some capacity to act. And it's useless to complain. In 2002, I was saying it's a duty to be optimistic. Now I'm very pessimistic. And I think for me, the first move would be to accept the fact that what we have done since late 2001 led Afghanistan to a disaster. I think we have to bring it to at all the level, it has been a disaster. I think first we have to somehow agree on that. And after, okay, what can we do? And I'm totally convinced that a military presence is necessary, but I'm totally convinced that the military weapon is a very, very, very small part of the solution. So I think Obama, he has built part of his campaign on promising to build more troops within Afghanistan. He had to do that. First, to show to Afghans, and not only to Americans, that he still care about this country. So I think he had to do that. But I don't think it's a good move on the long run. So I'm totally convinced about that.
That was a model question in being concise. We'll have more now, yes.
First of all, I want to thank you guys for coming. Dr. Shahani, Bishar Khosh Amaden. I had a question, particularly for you, Dr. Shahrani. The timing of the death of Ahmad Shah Massoud was a very suspicious time, and that it was 2 days before the attacks of 9/11, and then what happened, what followed after that, going into Afghanistan and whatnot. So I want you, and if you guys would like to add as well, you're more than welcome to. If you guys can, if you could talk about the significance of his death and how things would have been different if he still were alive, and also the negative repercussions if an ethnicity, different ethnicity such as Uzbek or Tajik or Turkmen or someone were to get the presidency, what would happen then? So.
I think the politicization of ethnicity and the model that I described, the political culture that I described, is not owned just by Pashtuns. Any other ethnic group who has had access to power has emulated and enforced exactly the same thing. Rabbani did the same thing. The Taliban did the same thing. Every government. So it's the political culture is not belonging to anyone. It's a model that everybody basically knows, understands, and uses it. On the issue of what if Ahmad Shah Massoud was alive, Allah only knows, as we say in Persian. Khuda behtar mifhama. We know his targeting before 9/11 was obviously purposeful, that they wanted him to be removed from the scene, and they successfully did that, and then did the attack in New York. So again, his successors were obviously people who joined the coalition or the initial attack against Taliban. They had been fighting, and they were not the caliber of a leader that Ahmad Shah Massoud was. And I think his absence has also divided the Tajiks and those who were around him, as well as some of the other ethnic groups who had coalesced with him from the north, center, and others. They came to be basically divided by later developments, that people who had the money, who had the backing of international community, managed to buy or rent certain segments of that, so that we don't have really an alternative opposition or alternative vision, alternative leadership of the kind that the country needs. And maybe we could have done something to create and support the possibility of emergence of such an entity. It hasn't. So Afghanistan is sort of left in the lurch with the whole same question: who could rule Afghanistan, rather than how Afghanistan should be governed. That it create institutions so that people could come, and then look for people to come in and do the organizational work. But we're not doing that. The easy thing is to find one person, and the person we find also has no vision. The only structure that's familiar is the one that I described, and they continue to work on it.
We have a question.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all three of the speakers for fascinating presentations, and all three of you invoked at one point or another the regional context. None of you really addressed it, and I'm curious how you see events that are going on in Pakistan and Iran primarily, I suppose, but maybe some of the former Soviet states as well. As you know, there's shared ethnicities across both of those borders, and unstable governments. And right now in Pakistan, 300 people were arrested at a protest march this morning who were supporting the Nawaz Sharif. I don't have a proper question, but to what extent does the solution in Afghanistan depend on bringing the regional states together in some sort of a combined strategy?
It's a good question, and I think we all did touch on it, but none of us maybe wanted to address it, because it is in some ways the most delicate and tricky question of them all, but also the essential question. You're not going to solve the problems in Afghanistan without also addressing problems in Pakistan. And really, I think you really need to address, Iran has to be part of the equation as well. Those three countries, of course, it expands, because when you bring in Iran, you're also bringing in Iraq. When you bring in Pakistan, you bring in India as well. But I think you can at least look at those three countries and the relationships between them, and how each of them defines themselves, their own tenuous identities, in relationship to their neighbors. Certainly, you can't understand Pakistan and its relationship with Afghanistan without understanding its paranoia about India, and the likelihood of being swamped by India should a war break out. You can't understand the situation in Afghanistan without understanding the safe havens that exist in Fatah and the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, and how that relates to a basically illegitimate border that was framed by colonial powers 100 years ago that broke up the Pashtun tribal zones as well. So I think you have to deal with that. And one thing that I'm optimistic about, I try to be as optimistic as possible. It is an act of will, as Alessandro mentioned. It's an act of will, but I think also, in part because I want this administration to be successful and think it has the potential to be successful, I think it's important to try not just to be optimistic, but optimism is to me a kind of a nostalgia, or it's a kind of a sentimental attitude. The way I would rather frame it is, I think it's important to try to understand things from a different frame than we have looked at it. The tendency is to butt our heads against a problem in the same way, rather than think optimistically. The cliche is out of the box, but I think we have to think about old problems in new ways. And I think one thing that gives me some hope is that Obama has asked Holbrooke to be his regional representative. He is somebody who understands diplomatic negotiations, the kinds of fragile ways in which parties have to be brought together. And he's also asked to look at it regionally and not just as an Afghan envoy. Because I do think that it's important that we have somebody who is targeting and looking carefully at all the actors, the factors, and who understands the delicacy of negotiation. So I do think that is something that is reason for optimism, as well as Obama's willingness to also bring Iran into play as well and to talk to Iran. So optimistic or what, I do think that there is some reason for hope there.
A couple of things. One, I think Ambassador Holbrooke has started his mission, and we were very hopeful. But his first trip to Afghanistan was disappointing to Afghans in Kabul. That he spent 2-3 days there, apparently only saw government officials and embassies and so forth. One Afghan opposition group called me to ask me to see if they could see Holbrooke. Said, I can't do a thing about that. I mean, this is the sort of thing that he should have, before going to Kabul, he should have known. Who are people outside the government that he should be speaking to? If we continue to speak to the same people, get the same advice, nothing is going to change. And that's the sad part. So far, they have been talking only to the same people who have been advising them for the last 8 years. On Pakistan relationship, I just wanted to suggest two things. One is there is a very long-standing Afghan border dispute with Pakistan. That's the Durand line. And that darn line is not illegitimate. If you look by any law, there has been a recent dissertation that has studied everything, Australian National University, all the documents and so forth. The reason why the Kabul regimes have refused to accept this international border line is utterly political and politicizing basically internal sort of support for themselves amongst the Pashtuns against Pakistan rather than anything legitimate. The first thing we should help the Afghan government do is to recognize this. Recognition of that is not going to divide the Pashtuns. You know, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, everybody else in Afghanistan were divided. Not only divided, they were barbed wire for 70 years in the borders. Nobody in Kabul raised a voice against that. But Durand line has been part of the problem, and much of Pakistani policy has been based on that one. The second thing is we have to accept the principle of community self-governance based on community values. Remember, recently in Swat, the Pakistani government reached an agreement that so-called Sharia will be accepted to be the rule in that particular area. If this is the people who want to live by Sharia, why should we object to that? I don't understand that, other than the fact that we're going to push our own values on people. There's certain issues of human rights that needs to be, of course, respected, and we should insist on that. But Sharia does not mean necessarily the hideous things that the Taliban did. And if you give the same rights for Taliban with a central government in place to make laws and oversee the laws, but allow the implementation at the local level, The Taliban may not be able to do the kinds of things they want in their own areas. People simply would not stand for it. It'll take 4 or 5 years, one round of elections, and they will be booted out. But we have to be willing to allow that sort of thing to happen. Nobody is allowing that to happen. And that is really, those are the challenges in terms of what needs to be done, in terms of thinking out of the box, if we are indeed willing to think out of the box.
Before we change the subject, I think Swat Valley is controlled by Islamic thugs because they were refugees that came, they were slaughtered the day they came back to the Swat Valley. I disagree with you totally.
Next question back here.
Dr. Shahani, I think this goes off what you were just talking about with allowing the Taliban to perhaps run for office and all that. Recently, President Obama has said he wants to open a dialogue with perhaps some more moderate elements of the Taliban, and one of their spokesmen recently said that those elements don't exist. How do you feel about that?
I think this notion of moderate Taliban certainly has been an oxymoron for a long time. And I have said sometimes, if you find a moderate Nazi, I'll find you a moderate Talib. That may not be so. But we're not talking about this, you know, there may be these individuals like Mullah Omar and others who are running away. They're not even in the country. What would happen if we began a dialogue? Again, the question is, what are we talking to them about? Okay? There is nothing. The only thing is giving them ministerial posts, to 5 of them, perhaps. Okay? But what about local people who support them? That's where we need to start a negotiation. Are you willing to, run the governance of your own communities? Would that be something attractive to you? Let's talk about it. Let's enshrine it in the Constitution. That's what should have been done in the new Constitution of Afghanistan. But the Pashtun elite who framed that Constitution made sure that that would not be the case. They wanted to dictate everything from the center the way the monarchs had done. And that's what exactly has happened. So that there is no room for dialogue, for discussion, nothing. They have to take it by force and then do whatever they want. So why not let them be elected? Let the people deal with them. Make the problem local people's problem rather than our problem. The harshness of the interpretation of Sharia should be made local people's problem. Is that the kind of Islam they really want? Is that really Islam? Those are the kinds of issues that the government can help introduce, and let the people address that issue. Americans cannot address the interpretation of Sharia for anybody. Muslims have to do it. And local Muslims are best positioned to do that. You couldn't do that sort of Sharia in my part of Afghanistan where my family lives. Nobody would stand for that. Okay, and I trust that the Pashtuns would not stand for that for very long either, if they knew there was a government that actually oversaw the implementation of the national laws and had respectable people who give the interpretation of Sharia that people from the local level could identify with, not government's cronies and bought mullahs and ulama and so forth. So that's the issue.
I just would add this. I mean, I take issue with Nazif on this, that I think the analogy, even a facetious one to the Nazis with the Taliban, is misdirected, in part because I think the Nazis were people who, they were card-carrying members of a political party with rules and regulations, officers, and the rest. The Taliban, I think, is a much more amorphous entity, and there certainly are a group of Taliban who are at the center of the movement, and I think it's not one movement, but a variety of movements right now, who are, in fact, dedicated, ideologically motivated party people. But I think an awful lot of people who are involved with the Taliban are there because of opportunities for resources, because it's more a convenient place and a safer place to be right now than other places. So I think that there are groups of people who are associated with the Taliban who might be, if in the right circumstances and with the right if you could convince them that the government was something that was going to be around and that was going to represent their interests, that you could negotiate with people who are now associated with the Taliban who could move out later. And just in reference to your point, I mean, and again, to take issue with Nazif, I think that it's one thing to say, and I agree with him, that if a community wants to be to have at the center of its principles, its code of conduct, its law, the Sharia, then that's great. But I do think that in what we've seen in Swat and other places is people coming in, killing off local people, forcing them out, and imposing Sharia, and no opportunity for people to actually represent what it is they want. So I think that if it's in fact truly a grassroots movement, then that's one thing. But I think in Swat it's not that we actually do see people who've come in and imposed their will on the local people.
Here.
As a woman, I'm quite attuned to the idea of the imposition of power. I saw a film about deforestation in Nepal due to overpopulation. They asked a man and his wife whether the use of contraception would be in accord with the local civilization. The man said no, it wouldn't. The woman said, do we have to breed like pigs? Now, the other thing is that one of the truly astounding things about America is the willingness to lose. When we lose an election, the person who's lost it quits. If you can have an election which will allow the overthrow of whatever the local regime is, the local city council or whatever, then you can use it to allow the evolution of a functioning civil society. If that doesn't happen, it won't work. You're talking very much in the power to the people format. Return the power to the local community. And the community is posed, the people themselves, the culture is opposed against outsiders and opposed against corruption. And Alessandro has a different perspective, which in some ways overlaps, particularly in the idea of corruption, but he's looking within the community and saying the bottom is fighting the top. That the people who are of low stature are using a different ideology to obtain power.
It should be noted that in America, even sometimes the winner of elections will quit.
And yeah, go ahead.
So just on the last point, actually, I quite strongly agree with Nazif Sharani that local community, I hate the term community, because community comes from German sociology, it's Gemeinschaft, opposed to Gesellschaft, society, and I don't see any community, but let's say local units. I prefer that. Yeah, villages. Even villages, I'm not sure to understand what is it in Afghanistan. I think it's not a proper term. You have neighborhoods, hamlets, group of hamlets. But I agree that you have to put more empowerment at that level. And probably, if I want to be a little bit provocative again, I'm not sure Afghanistan needs much more state. I think somehow, we have to, probably we could have even understood the map of power in let's say, 96, somehow was mirroring something very deep in the society. And I think we should have tried to build on that and to empower somehow locally, but accepting against the NSP that the fact local groups, local units are deeply divided and bringing this division somehow on the scene. So that's why I quite agree with Nazif Sharani on the empowerment of local communities.
Let me just say something about NSP, the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan. It certainly conceptually is a very attractive idea, but on the ground, it's a mess. And part of the reason why people are also fighting over resources from the bottom up is that there is no legitimate center. If you have a legitimate center that can oversee the implementation of the laws by local communities. Right now, in Afghanistan, the central government makes laws, implements laws, and oversees laws. Is that possible? It hasn't been, because governors have shot up people. And Karzai sent commissions to investigate. His own governor having committed something against the community, and no reports have come, no punishments, no nothing, simply because it's just conflict of interest. You can't do that. So the first thing that needs to be done is to take away the power of implementation of the laws from the center, but you can only do that if you have locally constituted governance structure, not if that governance structure is imposed from the center as it is in Afghanistan. So that's part of the problem. The other issue is NSP has been given money. It's one-shot deal. My own village got $20,000 recently, and I heard they decided to buy solar panels. So every household now in the village has solar panel and electricity in their homes. Okay? This is wonderful. But what will happen when these cells malfunction? What will happen when 1 or 5 or 10 of them totally fail? There is no backup. Okay? There is no structure to generate some kind of income. Is there a structure? Everybody used to spend a few Afghani cents, whatever, to buy kerosene to have a few hours of, hurricane lamps to lit their homes. Why not create a structure that collects from those families who can afford, and those who can't, the other thing. And then from that, you can get somebody to be sent to get training in how to repair, how to maintain solar panels. And money that could be then used to replace if an unfortunate person's cells fail. So there is nothing to follow up, that you have to have some kind of investment. These foreign aid monies need to be turned into investments that can generate income so that you could, in fact, finance other small projects in the village. There's nothing, no follow-up. You give them the money, you walk away, and they buy the stuff. This has happened throughout the country.
I just want to pick up on one thing that Alessandro mentioned, which was the idea of more state versus less state. And I think that this is it's a really important issue, and one that's going to be difficult to solve.
A center that could have 20,000, 30,000 well-trained mobile soldiers, and then community police and community defense units, that they can respond again in terms of overseeing that laws, national laws that are created in Kabul are properly enforced in the local communities. This is, I'm not really saying anything new. This is American way. And it can be useful in places like Afghanistan if it was done properly. But that's not what we're doing. We want there this strong center with its army, police, and spies, and impose itself on the people. And traditional legacies of how states have operated basically tells us that it won't bring proper governance, and it certainly would be oppressive, and it would be one that would create more problems rather than solve any.
We have another, we're running.
May I just reacted to, I think it's important to have not only local communities and state, but intermediary, and that's very important to somehow to develop a culture of negotiation, which is very strong actually in Afghanistan. But I would like to come back on SWAT, because SWAT, it's a place which has been studied very intensely in the past by anthropologists, and it's a very stratified society. You had a kind of aristocracy who owned the land and were changing all the time places, and they had tenants. So I would like to have people, analysts, who are going and explaining the link between what is going on today with social structures. I have not read a single sentence on that. And in particular, I think SWAT and Waziristan in Pakistan have very different social structures, even being Pashtun society somehow, Pashtun-speaking places. The Waziristan, it was more equalitarian, classical model, acephalous tribe. SWAT was not. So if we want to understand what is going on with the so-called Taliban or Taliban-like people in Swat or Waziristan, we have to relate it with the knowledge we have on these societies. And it's very disappointing to read what we have to read now, I think, in the media. They don't give any clue to understand.
Let me just clear my point. My example of SWAT was not that I condone what happened in SWAT in per se. It's the principle of allowing communities to be able to manage their own affairs. If that's what they're fighting about with the center, then that's what needs to be negotiated. And how that is done specifically in each context may differ, but that's the principle that I'm advocating, not the specific.
We are now in, were this football game, this would be extra time that a referee would be maintaining a clock. Sudden death, we could call it, I guess. And I know we already have one microphone dispensed out here, and what's that? We have a second question back here. So what I think I would like to do is have those two questions stated and then give our panelists a chance to respond. And before I do that, will take the chair's prerogative of entering just one more thing. I'll do this very briefly. We have a sort of issue of locality and center that has come up, and we're sort of talking about points of connection between them. One thing I was wondering if any of you wish to comment on is the ways in which those can connect in an actual practical sense. I'm thinking about infrastructure and roads and sort of what role the kind of the construction of linkages and so on, which could help or could hinder depending on how they go forward. If anyone wishes to kind of take that up. Yes.
So first, I just had a comment about the situation in SWAT, which I think I think one of the facts that's often overlooked, at least my understanding, was that the local population had rejected the Islamists in the previous elections and, in fact, had voted rather overwhelmingly for secularist parties. So I agree with you about the principle, of sort of local self-determination, but I think, in fact, perhaps local people had made a different choice there, and it was precisely the center's accommodation with certain extremist groups that resulted in what we've seen, something that's been criticized roundly by some and by some human rights advocates like Iqbal Haidar and others in Pakistan. In 2001, it seemed like everybody was talking about Afghan women, sometimes for perhaps the wrong reasons, but now it seems as if no one is talking about them. And I've been especially troubled in all this discussion about negotiating with the Taliban as the solution that there's been very little discussion about the views of Afghan women or Afghan women rights activists about this and what the potential impact might be on Afghan women. And I wondered if you could comment about that issue and also just sort of generally where the issue of women's rights fits in any of the solutions that you envisage.
We'll take the last question, so we've heard all the questions.
Hello. As a non-academician, I like to just make an observation, and I don't expect. Oops. I don't expect if there will be any answer to that. If history is something that we all wish and all would like to learn from and then find solutions. Back in that area, over century or century and a half, the British quite successfully stayed there in that area by some way top-type monarchy and very decentralized community-type system. And I have been reading some history since I got some free time of North India and Pakistan, Balochistan, and Afghanistan. I'm wondering if I agree with this third gentleman from Yale that the pessimistic viewpoint that the chance of success is very, very remote. However, we could, as a U.S., form of government where we change the government every 4 years, and we don't seem to have any statesmanship of continuity from one government system, one government of 4 years to the next 4 years. That are we going to be able to provide a leadership in which could be successful in that type of a system which is in Afghanistan, which where education, where the resources are coming from outside, they're flowing in outside. There's nothing inside. How do we? What is the chance of success? As he said, I think the number 2 gentleman said that let them Islamistize the government, Sharia, and let them work themselves out. We can be sitting outside and, but I don't think the United States can do it. Okay. We have the United Nations, and that's a very, very challenging. You have 2 very strong blocks. We have the Russia and the China on one side and the rest of the world on the other side. It's a very, very challenging situation. That's my pessimistic viewpoint.
So we have here a question about what the chances in the future might be. I think why don't we have this be, each of you have a chance to address any of the last issues you wish to tie together, and then we'll draw it to a close.
Okay, I'd actually want to try to pull both of those 2 questions together around the idea of imposition from the outside of change, of transformation, of social change. I think in the case of both women's rights and of democracy, of electoral politics, in both cases, what happened, in the case of women's rights, it's happened several times in Afghan history. In the 1920s, when King Amanullah tried by fiat and overnight virtually to bring girls' education and the abandonment of the veil in other institutions, intended for very good reasons to improve the lot of women in Afghanistan, and again after 2001. And the focus, in some ways, the kind of obsessive focus by the U.S. on women's rights, along with the imposition of electoral politics, are both examples of how difficult and probably unworkable it is to try to impose solutions to problems that have existed for a very long time and that require transformational politics. Where women's rights had begun to change in Afghanistan was incrementally during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when through education, through the primary and secondary and university education, where more and more women were beneficiaries of institutional changes in the society, that it was happening in a much more evolutionary way. Where it's backfired is when governments have tried to impose those changes by fiat overnight, and there's been a backlash against it. And so I think it's very, you have to be very careful about how you approach those issues, because right now women's rights have actually been set back. And if ultimately what we want is to improve the lot of women, to give them opportunities, and most importantly, educational opportunities, which will be the foundation for other kinds of changes, you can't impose it from the outside, and you can't do it overnight. These are evolutionary changes, and I don't think there's any way around it in Afghan society. And I think also the same is true of electoral politics, that we imposed in 2002. We've put all of our eggs in the basket of democratic elections, and then we kind of announced our victory, and that gave us the opportunity also to go to Iraq, because after all the job was done, we elected a president and a parliament, and again, and the Constitution. But that electoral politics are not just based upon having elected officials or one round of elections. It's based upon a free press. It's based upon access to ideas, institutions fora within which it's possible to debate issues. And those things, again, are things that happen not overnight, but over a period of time.
I wanted to, this issue of there is nothing in Afghanistan or nothing inside, is probably a little too much. There is plenty of resources in Afghanistan if they were indeed developed. Afghanistan at one point was actually food surplus growing country. I remember when I was young that there were famines in India, and Afghanistan was sending food to India. And gradually we became, just producers of sufficient food to feed the country, and then food deficient. There is land, there is water, it needs to be developed. The governments did not develop, and the development projects that were done were not done in appropriate places, right places, economically feasible places. They were done in politically important parts of the country. There has been a lot of talk now recently about deposits of all kinds of important metals, copper, iron. I know every day there is something new coming up that there are other resources in the country. Water in particular, hydroelectric power in that country could be a major resource if anybody paid some attention to do it. And development is not economic problem, it's always political problem. It's problem of governance. We have not had the right kind of governance in the country to develop the resources that are there for the population that needs that development. On the issue of women, I don't think woman's problem or woman's issue is just woman's. It's man's problem. It's family problem. It's a very deep-rooted problem, and one that was born in a family in Afghanistan, grew up, and is quite familiar. It is a very, very serious problem, and it cannot be solved by outsiders coming and doing it in terms of just targeting women. We have to target families as the unit that they are, and educate men about these issues and the boys about these issues so that they think differently. And it has to be introduced in the curriculum and so forth. One important development for women in recent time is the fact that the Constitution allowed for representation of at least 2 women from each province of the country, so that there are now 68 women. 15 of those did not need anybody's help. They got elected on their own. So that tells you something, that there are people who would support women for leadership position. The rest came because of the stipulation that the Constitution had made. And the 8th of March, Women's Day, was just celebrated. And I watched television that comes from Kabul. They had a panel of 6 or 8 women, just 2 nights ago, I think I saw. Some of them deputies from the parliament. And they were arguing vigorously that nothing has been done, woman has been harmed, and so on and so forth. And then there were others who said, look, the fact that we are here obviously is an achievement, and let's give them something. But certainly we can do a lot more, but we have to, again, do it the right way. And the way I think that has been done so far, in minor cases, it's certainly in the case of a constitution, I think it was a great thing to do, because it just never was there in the previous constitutions. This was one of the innovative things that the Constitution did, and one hopes that the new government here would help. Again, we know the country depends. This is what I said. The political part of the political economy, political culture of Afghanistan is dependency on foreign money. How that money could be used to help build better society is our role as Americans, as Europeans who are giving money, that we need to have a say, and we need to have the right kind of say. And we can have the right kind of say only if we knew the right kinds of things. And again, if indeed policies are based on knowledge, there's lots of knowledge. We anthropologists who are sitting here our knowledge has not been used in Afghanistan to build peace. The government wants our knowledge to fight better war. And I personally am against the use of our knowledge to fight better wars. But I'm ready to help anybody who is willing to use our knowledge to build peace. Anywhere, Afghanistan or elsewhere.
So is it the last word? So I remember very often when I start by a joke. I was walking somewhere in Bamiyan, and all my friends were lining behind me. And suddenly I said, wow, that's unusual. Yeah, who knows? Maybe there is a mine over there. So normally when I have to start, I say, that's dangerous. It's even worse to end. So I don't know. First, on women, I think it's a very important issue, but I think we have to believe in political struggle and social struggle. We have somehow. I'm very disappointed to see how Afghan women are patronized somehow. And if I understood a little bit about feminism, you had different waves of feminism, and at least in the second or third waves, women from developing countries reproached women from Europe and North America to be patronizing them. And I think it's exactly what is going on now. So we have to, I think, to rehabilitate somehow this kind of decentered feminism and believe in Afghan women, because I have a few Afghan women who are friends who are extremely, I would say, uneasy with the way they are depicted in the media. And I think we have to believe in them, and we have to be fully aware that it's a very long process. And they have to invent new ways. Elections, I think, they have been a success. I was surprised. I was in October 2004 in Afghanistan when Karzai was elected president, and I was surprised to see how smoothly things went. It was a symbolic and technical success, but the big problem, it didn't build legitimacy, because once again other things were missing, which are probably more important than election. And these things are giving revenues to the state and agreeing on something on the past, which is able to build the present and the future. And here, part of my life at least was spent in Switzerland, and one of the basic principles of Swiss federalism is that languages, religions, and territorial units do not correspond. So I think we can imagine a kind of subsidiarity system with a localized and supra-localized power, which are not based on ethnicity somehow. That's and my last point. Which is we are all three anthropologists, and all the time I think, let's reverse the picture. Let's imagine that Afghans will come in my country, which is not yours, but also imagine that Afghans will come in your country and will do what we are doing to their country. Imagine that people who went just a few months and sometimes only weeks in a country without knowing a single word of the local language, and who are experts of this country. Could you imagine an Afghan specialist of the United States who spent a few months in the United States just able to say, hello, how are you? And doesn't speak any English. I think we have all the time, I'm trying all the time to apply this very basic anthropological rule to myself. Let's reverse the situation and think and see and realize how problematic is our way of talking about others.
Well, I noticed that. That was a wonderful last word, and you'll note the power of the chair, whose question was utterly ignored by all of the panelists. Let me simply draw things to a close by thanking all of you for your attention and for your attendance at this event, which I think is itself an important phenomenon of our day today. We'll obviously be talking lots about all of the issues that were turned up today, and I hope you will find yourselves better informed because of your attendance. If you found your interest whetted by any of these particular issues, we've had remarkable assistance from all of our visitors today. I would urge you to remember these names, go to Shame and Drum, go to bookstores, look up their books, start reading from this point onward, and it will open another further world into Afghanistan. But for now, let me ask you please to join me in simply thanking our visitors for their talks today.